Are failed states a global threat? We'll find out next on The Line. We're talking today about failed states and how much of a danger they present. Are they global threats? Just in March, when Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton was justifying the U.S. action in Libya, she said it was necessary to prevent Libya from becoming a giant Somalia. A new book has been written by Stewart Patrick, who's a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. The book is called Weak Links. And Mr. Patrick makes the argument that perhaps failed states are not the grave danger to international security that has been believed. Stewart Patrick joins us today to talk about his new book, Weak Links. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, to what extent is this notion that failed states are the gravest danger in international affairs? How long has that been in place, that notion, and where did it come from?
Well, it really dates from 9/11. Before the attack on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon in September 11th of 2001, we tended to regard weak and failing states around the world primarily as a humanitarian issue. They occasionally tugged at our heartstrings and opened our purse strings, but by and large, we considered them third tier at best national security concerns. But what happened on 9/11 was that a terrorist group attacked the United States from one of the most wretched countries in the world. And that led to this sea change in U.S. threat perceptions. And not just U.S. threat perceptions, but globally. And this was typified by the statement made in the 2002 National Security Strategy by then-President George W. Bush when he said, "We're now less threatened by conquering states than we are by weak and failing ones." And this has led to a huge reorientation of the whole national security apparatus in the United States.
When we see it even just this week when it was reported in newspapers that with the president of Yemen having fled, that now there was concern that Yemen would become a chaotic failed state, and so the CIA is now preparing to go into Yemen here and there in pursuit of al-Qaeda terrorists, and yet those al-Qaeda types have been in Yemen for some time. It's not that they just found a haven there because all of a sudden there's some question of who's in authority in Yemen.
So that's absolutely right. Al-Qaeda has been active in Yemen for quite some time and was responsible, as you know, for the bombing of the USS Cole, for instance, prior to 9/11. Looking around the world, there are about 50, maybe 60 countries that could be classified as weak and failing or fragile states. That is, states that don't deliver the fundamental things that we come to associate with a sovereign state. Those things include providing basic physical security, providing basic social welfare, and an economy that is conducive to private sector growth. A lot of states around the world just don't do that. What's happened since 9/11 is that there's been a preoccupation, in a sense, with all of those countries as potential threats, whether for terrorism or transnational crime or epidemic disease. And the difficulty with this broad brush approach is that it doesn't really leave policymakers with much room for analytical clarity or setting priorities. Now, there are some countries, like Yemen, that do fit the bill. But they fit the bill in being threats to the United States, not simply because they're weak, but because of some other factors.
Now, as you've mentioned in the book, al-Qaeda, before finding a haven in Afghanistan, which wasn't really a chaotic state at the point they went there, it was under a sort of brutal rule of the Taliban, and then they were sheltered by the Taliban. But before that, they had been trying to make a go of it in Somalia, and just perhaps finding that the day-to-day existence was difficult in a failed state and didn't leave them time or the infrastructure they needed to try try to plot their plots.
Yeah, the conventional wisdom is that a perfect place for an organization like Al-Qaeda would be a collapsed state, a totally ungoverned space where there's no need to worry about any governmental authority. But there are some really fascinating cables that were intercepted during the 1990s when Al-Qaeda, operating out of Sudan, out of Khartoum, was trying to establish a beachhead in the Horn of Africa. And the cables coming back to bin Laden are fascinating because because of the nature of the complaints that these Al-Qaeda operatives are making. They say, this place is impossible. These people are clannish. There's no operational security. We keep getting held up by bandits. We have no logistical capabilities, so we can't get communication to the outside world or transfer money. And there's even a suggestion by some of these guys that what we really need in Somalia is an Islamic state-building project. So it's quite ironic because the same complaints that, UN peacekeepers were making during the 1990s, they were also making about Somalia. And I think the lesson of Somalia, at least at that point, was that the notion of a safe haven in a collapsed or truly failed state is a contradiction in terms.
And we see when the U.S. was finally able to track down Osama bin Laden, it wasn't in the lawless areas of the borderlands between Afghanistan and Pakistan, but rather in a functioning sort of modern city that wasn't too far away from where the Pakistani military academy was, which is sort of almost the definition of the most secure, stable place you would find in Pakistan.
There's a great lesson there, I think, from the Pakistani example, and that is that we tend to have a vision of sort of a firm distinction between either a state sponsor of terrorism or a state which is totally against terrorism. And what Pakistan reminds us is that there's a lot of blurry middle ground between those two options, those two poles. For years, the Pakistani government has been quite willing to support extremist jihadi groups because it uses them for its own purposes, particularly with respect to Kashmir and its ongoing dispute there with India. The Pakistani intelligence services, the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, itself appears to be fragmented. So you have a fragmented state in Pakistan where some people are very much in league with the extremists. And this probably explains why bin Laden was able to live what appears to be a reasonably comfortable life for years, not far from the Pakistani military.
And one of the things you point out in the book is that this applies not only to the question of terrorism, but to other global threats as well. So in narco trafficking, one often would think that it would be the lawless area where the grand bandits would be most able to flourish in their drug trading. And yet, as you argue in the book, that drug traffickers actually prefer for there to be some kind of stable authority because it's easier to corrupt an authority than it is to be in charge of all the security for yourself.
That's precisely right. Drug traffickers and other transnational organized criminals want a weak but somewhat functioning state that, as you say, they can corrupt. It's also interesting that some of the weakest states, in the same way that they are not very congenial for transnational terrorists, are not particularly congenial for transnational criminals as well. And what you often find are that the countries that are really plagued the most by crime are those that are actually a bit stronger institutionally, but still have some governance gaps that can be exploited. It's no surprise that South Africa, for instance, has become a hotbed of crime because it's a country in which the developed and developing world exists side by side. Enormous levels of corruption and yet very much connected to the sinews of the global economy. Another example is Mexico. And notwithstanding the fact that some U.S. generals from Joint Forces Command suggested that it was on the verge of being a failed state, it's actually quite obviously quite a functioning state, nowhere near a sort of an Afghanistan or even a Pakistan level of dysfunction. But the reason, of course, that it's become such a hotbed of crime is that it's on the border of the United States and is basically catering to our insatiable demand, it would appear, for illegal narcotics.
And has the infrastructure that can be used, communication infrastructure, transportation infrastructure that allows for it to be used as a transportation hub.
Absolutely. So the criminals will accept a slightly higher degree of risk to be actually operating in places that are geographically and logistically more convenient, and also provide higher returns than they would get from operating in a rather obscure location.
Well, this is On the Line, and we're talking with Stewart Patrick, who's author of the new book, Weak Links. And this book looks at the question of whether failed states really are the centerpiece, the locus of global threats these days. Stewart, how did you look at this question from a academic point of view? What did you do to test the question of whether failed states are really the place where global threats are emanating?
I was struck, first of all, by the fact that it seemed like so much of our assumptions and conventional wisdom was really on the basis of a number of isolated anecdotes. And so I wanted to test that. And by way of full disclosure, I was at the State Department during the first term of the Bush administration in the policy planning staff, and occasionally writing about what a danger weak and failing states were. And once I got out, so there's some misguided policy. It may be, indeed. I feel like I contributed to this. And then I got out, I thought, well, we've been saying this, but is it really true? And so the way I went about it was, first I worked with my colleague who was at the Brookings Institution, Susan Rice, who's obviously gone on to bigger and better things at the United Nations, on an index of state weakness in the developing world. And that basically allowed us to rank all 141 developing countries according to their level of institutional strength. And then I went through the different chapters on terrorism, on weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, epidemic disease, etc. I went through each of the chapters, and I did a combination of global mapping to look at where these threats were actually taking place, and how it compared to the ranking of state strength. And then I also did a lot of little mini case studies of some cases where the linkage appeared to exist, but in many cases where the links were really much stronger with sort of more well-equipped developing countries, countries like China or Russia, as opposed to the true basket cases that we normally think about.
What are the few places that you found really did give evidence for this thesis that's been the underpinning of so much policy in the last decade?
A great case in point is the tiny West African country of Guinea-Bissau, which became, over the last few years, basically a wholly owned subsidiary of Colombian drug cartels. It is one of the poorest countries in the world with abysmal human development indicators, etc. But every month, it was getting shipments of cocaine that were equivalent to, or perhaps even exceeding, the annual value of its gross domestic product.
In a given month.
In a given month. I would say Pakistan has elements of, I mean, it certainly is a weak state. It's a country that is where many different dangers come together. But as I said, including terrorism and weapons of mass destruction, because the integrity of the Pakistani nuclear complex is something that keeps people up late at night. So that is certainly an area of concern. But it also points to my broader thesis that you have to look not just at the institutional capacity of the country, but also the will of the ruling regime. That is an important component when you're talking about state weakness or state fragility that you need to bear in mind.
Well, someplace like North Korea, there you have a state that nobody could say this is a successful state, especially if your conditions for success have anything to do with the way the people of the country live and what services the state provides. But it's certainly a functioning totalitarian state, and it's not failed in that regard. They have an iron grip over their territory and their population, and it is one of the places that is one of the biggest risks of nuclear proliferation. And to what extent are nuclear proliferators places that could be described as failed or